Hi and welcome to tutorial 10, Critical Thinking. The aim of this tutorial is to help you understand one of the most important skills at university, critical thinking. By the end of the tutorial, you should have developed your understanding of what we mean by critical thinking, how to think more critically, and how to read and write more critically. Critical thinking, also called critical evaluation or critical appraisal, is one of the most important skills that you'll definitely develop at university. In fact, critical thinking is behind all successful academic work. Despite this though, critical thinking is one of the least understood skills among students, so you will give yourself a head start by understanding what critical thinking actually means. Let's consider this now. Critical thinking is a sort of questioning type of thinking where you don't just simply believe what you're told, you question it and think it through for yourself before you accept that it's true. In other words, critical thinking isn't just accepting things at face value. Now be careful not to fall into the trap of confusing critical thinking with criticism. They are two different things. The everyday term criticism could be considered quite a negative process where we try to find fault with things. But critical thinking is a more sort of positive process where you work out whether something is convincing or not. Critical thinking is very different to the kind of thinking that's required at school and at college. At school and college, you might have unquestioningly accepted what you read or what you heard in books and lectures. You might have passed assignments by simply regurgitating facts. But this won't be the case at university. So from now on, you should start practicing a more sort of questioning type of thinking, where you don't just immediately accept the things that you read and hear. Let's apply this concept of critical thinking to everyday life. Imagine that you're buying a car. If you were taking an uncritical approach, you'd probably not shop around. You'd probably believe everything that you were told by the car's salesperson, and you'd probably just buy the first car that you liked. If you were being critical though, you'd probably view lots of different cars, you'd compare them on their various features. You'd probably also be quite sceptical of what the salespeople said about the car. And eventually you'd make a well-informed decision about what car to buy. So you can see from this example that you probably are already being critical in everyday life. All you need to do now is learn how to apply this kind of thinking to your academic work. Being critical in your reading and writing at university means questioning the ideas and the evidence that you come across. Now this can be challenging at first because you might wonder, well, what right do I have to question the ideas of experts in my field? However, this kind of questioning process is actually really encouraged and welcomed at university. For example, when critically reading an idea presented by an author, you might ask, well, does this idea seem convincing? Or is there sufficient evidence to back it up? Let's consider the example of the claim that human beings only use 10% of their brains. Now, this is a very commonly held belief, and if we were being uncritical, we would readily accept this to be true, especially because lots of people believe it. But just because this claim is a popular belief doesn't mean that it's true. If we were being critical, we would question the claim and consider the evidence to back it up. So let's try and dissect this now. By stating that we only use 10% of our brains, the claim is basically saying that 90% of our brains are redundant. But if we look at evidence from brain damaged patients, we know that even small damage to any part of the brain can have a huge impact on the functioning of the patient. So this definitely goes against the idea that 90% of our brains are not in use. But without looking at the evidence, there are actually other reasons to be suspicious about this claim. If you think about it, you might question, well, why would we have bothered developing such big brains through evolution if we only use 10% of them? So you can see that through this questioning and dissecting process, we're actually starting to doubt the credibility of the claim. And in fact, there's no scientific publication out there that supports the claim at all. So although it might not be particularly relevant to social work, this is a very good example of where critical thinking is important. Let's look now at how you would be critical in your reading at university. Let's say that you're reading to prepare for an assessment. You'd probably come across lots of potentially useful sources to help inform your assessment in the books, maybe the journal articles and websites that you came across. But as we saw in tutorial 5, not all sources are suitable. So the first thing that you need to do by thinking critically is determine whether the source can be used, whether it's credible. So to do this, you have to ask questions such as the following. Is this source reliable? Is it not biased in any way? Who's the intended audience? So for example, if it's a textbook for high school pupils, it's likely to be too basic. When was it published? If it was published in the 1980s, for example, it's probably not going to give you an up-to-date perspective on the topic that you're reading about. Who's the author? Are they an expert in the field? Are they attached to a reputable organisation? Or are they a journalist who might report in a biased way? Remember to take special care when using information from websites, as we covered in tutorial 5. You should avoid those aimed at the general public and only cite those targeted at academic or professional audiences. In this slide, we've got a newspaper article that reports the results of a research study. Pause the video here while you apply some critical reading and think about whether this source would be appropriate to use in your assignment. The article in the previous slide is a good example of sources that should be avoided. It's targeted at the general public, so it's not appropriate for an academic piece of work. We've got no details about the researcher, so we don't know her credentials, so we can't say how reliable the article is. Also, if you think critically about what the article is actually claiming, that how people hold a pen can predict heart problems, it's not really very convincing, especially as the research was based on only 61 patients. So based on these critical thoughts, we can dismiss this article as lacking credibility. So again, this is a good example of critical thinking. As well as being critical in your reading, you need to show that you're being critical in your writing at university. And this is one of the most common areas where students will lose marks. So you will really benefit if you know about this. So how can you demonstrate that you're being critical in your writing? Well, just as you would gather evidence and compare different options if you were buying a car, you need to do the same thing in your writing. So in your writing, you'll be being critical if you do things like compare and contrast, consider the evidence, consider the strengths and weaknesses. The next slide gives some examples of this kind of writing. Here we have an example of ways of demonstrating critical analysis in writing. The examples relate to an essay question that asks you to critically analyse 3 theories. Let's just call them theories A, B and C. Pause the video while you read through the examples and notice the wording that the writer uses to demonstrate that they're being critical. Critical thinking is a difficult concept to get your head round, so don't worry if at this stage it all seems a bit difficult to follow. The important point to take from all of this is that you need to go beyond simple description or regurgitation in your written work. In the previous example, if you were just to describe what theories A, B and C stated, You wouldn't be demonstrating that you are thinking critically about the theories. Instead, you really need to show that you're thinking at a higher level by comparing and contrasting the theories, by referring to the evidence that supports them and thinking about the strengths and the weaknesses of the different theories. We'll consider some examples of this before finishing this tutorial. In this slide, the writer is writing about two different models of health. This is a bad example of critical writing because the writer has failed to go beyond simple description. There are no comparisons drawn, no considerations of the strengths and weaknesses of the models, and no evidence mentioned. In essence, although it might be quite a well-written paragraph or two, this example is just a simple description of the two different models. Pause the video while you read through the example, and then we'll look at a more critical example. Here we have an extract on the same topic, but this time the writer has been critical. Notice how, as shown in red, the writer starts with description, but then goes beyond this description by comparing the models of health and considering their strengths and their weaknesses. Pause the video again while you read through the example, and then we'll move on to the final slide. To sum up, critical thinking is a key skill at university. It involves questioning the ideas and evidence that you come across, rather than just accepting them. When you're reading, always ensure that the sources that you read are credible. Look for signs of bias and consider the credentials of the author. Avoid publications aimed at the general public. Critical writing is a skill that's going to take a bit of time to develop. To achieve it, try to say to yourself that you need to go beyond simple description by comparing and contrasting, drawing upon evidence and considering strengths and weaknesses. And finally, critical thinking isn't just a skill that you'll use at university. It's an essential skill as a social worker, where you'll use it to make decisions about the best